Hello and welcome to Creating Disciples with me, Austin Roberts. We are excited to have you join us today as we are going to be taking a look at an event that happened in the life of Jesus. Now, this particular event, although it's recorded over some different gospels, we're going to be taking a look specifically at the account of the Gospel of John. There are some important lessons for us to learn here about the way we interact with Jesus and about the way we interact with others. So we're excited to have you join us, and we hope the Lord blesses this delivery of His message and His word. Senator and author Paul Simon tells this story about Elijah Lovejoy. He writes, "The great American hero, editor, schoolteacher, and Presbyterian clergyman Elijah Lovejoy left the pulpit and returned to the press in order to be sure his words reached more people. The Civil War might have been averted and a peaceful emancipation of slaves achieved had there been more like him. After observing one lynching, Lovejoy was committed forever to fighting uncompromisingly the awful sin of slavery. Mob action was brought against him time after time. Neither this nor many threats and attempt on his life deterred him. Repeated destruction of his presses did not stop him. If by compromise is meant that I should cease from my duty, I cannot make it. I fear God more than I fear man. Crush me if you will, but I shall die at my post," Lovejoy said. And he did die at his post. 4 days later, after saying that, at the hands of another mob, he perished. Not one of the ruffians was prosecuted or indicted or punished in any way for this murder. Some of Lovejoy's defenders, in fact, were prosecuted, and one of the mob assassins was later elected mayor of the town of Alton. However, note this. One young man was deeply moved by the Lovejoy martyrdom. He had just been elected to the Illinois legislature. His name? Abraham Lincoln. We are what we do. It's easy to say different things. It's easy to claim different things. But the truth is, we are what our actions say we are. And sometimes we give emotional responses to different things. And our actions often define us much more than our words. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes it's easy to get angry about injustice in this world. All you've got to do is take a look around, and injustice is everywhere. This world is rife with terrible things. If you turn on the TV and watch the news, or you open your computer and get on the internet and look at the headlines, you look at your phone and see another alert for another shooting, another bombing, another attack, more terrorism. There is injustice everywhere. And the truth is, it's easy to get angry. But the scary thing is, it's easy to get angry as you sit there on the couch and then don't do anything about it. We get angry for but a moment and then sit there and our lives go on. Well, perhaps there's a lesson then we can learn from Jesus. You see, anger is a natural response to things like this because they happen. And we cannot always control when or where or how often these things happen. It is a dark and dangerous world out there, and these things will inevitably happen because that is just part of living in a sinful world. But there are things we can do, and there are ways we can harness our anger to better continue to combat these things. So, I would like to invite you to open with me. We're going to read in the Gospel of John from chapter 2. So we're going to read an account here, an account of something that Jesus does, a story you've probably heard, and something that's interesting. Now, there is some background to this text. So, if you notice, we're very near the beginning of the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John itself does not actually have the story of the Nativity. It begins in John chapter 1 with the famous words, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," and so on and so forth. And then, very early on there in John, we see John the Baptist denying being the Messiah. He then testifies about Jesus. Then his disciples, John's disciples, decide to follow Jesus. Then Jesus calls his first disciples, according to this gospel, Philip and Nathanael. And then we get near to the text where we are. He does his first miracle by changing water into wine at the wedding in Cana. And here we have finally arrived at our text. So we're going to read John chapter 2, and we're going to start in verse 13. Now, as you read with me, think about the way you may react when you're angry at something that is unjust or unfair. So let's read together. John 2, starting with verse 13. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." Jesus is angry. In fact, Jesus is very angry. But before we get into the story itself, let's talk about some of the surrounding things about this story. Now, there are some theories. You see, we read this story in John chapter 2, which is obviously very near the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. However, the other three Gospels, the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record this story as happening near the end of the ministry of Jesus. So there are a couple theories surrounding that. First, it is possible that an event like this may have happened twice. Once near the beginning of Jesus' ministry and once near the end of Jesus' ministry. Now, there are some problems with that theory, as many biblical scholars and theologians have pointed out. Primarily, it is highly unlikely that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law, the Jews, and so on and so forth would have allowed something like that to happen more than once. So, although that is certainly a theory, it is unlikely to be correct. Second, another theory is that this is the same story, but for some reason, John records it in a different place. Now, as is true with any group of four people who all tell the same story, there are bound to be differences in details. Matthew, Mark, and Luke record it in one place, John records it in another place. So it is possible that somebody doesn't quite have their chronology correct. And that is the more likely of the theories that biblical scholars and theologians have. So, that's what we've got here. Now, the truth is, despite what is correct, and despite the fact that we can't for certain know what is correct, what we do know is that this is something that happened. This is an event that took place during Jesus' ministry on this earth, where he went into the temple and overturned the tables and drove out the money changers and those who were selling animals. So now let's get into the story, and we're going to ask the question, why does Jesus react with such anger? Well, as outlined by the Scottish scholar William Barclay, there are three primary reasons as to why Jesus would have been so angry in this context. And Barclay outlines them in a way that's easy to understand. First, this is a place of worship. This is a place of worship, and yet there appears to be no reverence. You see, in this place of worship, we've got a couple things that are going on here. A couple things for us to note. You see, we've got people changing money and selling animals. Now, that would have been something normal and something that Jesus would have been entirely okay with, except that there was this small issue of the method that they were taking. You see, many pilgrims came from far and wide to visit the temple, to sacrifice there, and to worship their God. So when they came there, naturally, they didn't always have the correct money to pay for animals to make sacrifices. So what would happen then? They would need to exchange their money for the temple money. So they would go to a money changer, they would put down a sum of money and get money in return. But as biblical scholars and theologians have done research, they have found that it is possible and perhaps even likely that these money changers were charging close to a 100% commission for changing money. Now, there is nothing fundamentally wrong with charging commission for changing money. If you go and visit any foreign country, you go to Canada, Mexico, somewhere in Europe, somewhere in Asia, somewhere in Africa, you go anywhere, you will get charged a small commission for exchanging money. If you put your debit card in an ATM machine, they'll charge you a small percent, 2-3% maybe. If you go and take cash to a money changer, you'll get charged something a little more. But regardless, it's nothing near 100% to change money. That's ridiculous. Nobody, if they were changing money in a different country, would agree to pay a 100% commission to change that money. So Jesus sees that and he says, you are being unfair. Many of the people who come from far and wide don't have a lot of money. So what the people in the temple are doing, what the money changers are doing, is they are robbing the poor people who are coming. They're making the poor even poorer by making their money worth even less. And so Jesus gets angry. Now, continuing on, the second reason why he may have been angry is because animal sacrifices were no longer required. Now, I understand that back in the time of the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, particularly in books like Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, where there are a lot of laws outlined, sacrifice is required. But as we move through the timeline of the Old Testament, it becomes evident later that Jesus doesn't require it anymore. In fact, you can read texts in books like Jeremiah, books like Habakkuk, that talk about that fact and say, listen, animal sacrifice was something that was required at one point, but Jesus and God are moving away from that model to something else entirely. So animal sacrifices weren't required. And as if that were not enough, imagine these people coming. They have brought their animals, and they brought them to sacrifice. But obviously the people at the temple wanted to make money, as is evident by what we've heard about the money changers. So if you were to bring your own animal to sacrifice in the temple at that time, you would bring it in, and it is likely that a priest would look at your animal, whether it was a sheep, a goat, a cow, pigeons, doves, whatever you had brought to sacrifice. They would look at it and they would declare that it was not up to their standard. Therefore, you would then be required to buy an animal that was being sold there at the temple at a premium price, something much more expensive than the animals you would buy outside of the temple. And so as if the money changing issue wasn't enough, then you had to pay an extra price to buy an expensive animal that you would sacrifice. Now, you can kind of see here that the temple is just running this one big Ponzi scheme, this one big ripoff. And I don't know about you, but I believe probably everyone in life has been ripped off at one point or another, and it's not a fun experience. You pay money for something, for some good, some object, some service, and then what you get back is subpar. In fact, I remember I bought an Apple Watch charger recently. I bought this Apple Watch charger. I was excited because it would charge my phone, my watch, and my headphones all at the same time. So I bought it, I plugged it in, it charged my phone, it charged my headphones, and the Apple Watch portion of the charger was broken. Naturally, I was not very happy, so I returned it, and then I began to look at some of the reviews of this particular item. And you know what? The reviews were not good. In fact, almost to a T, they all said something very similar. They said the phone portion works, the headphone portion works, but this Apple Watch charger, it's cheaply made, it doesn't work. It will just heat up your watch until it's very hot and then won't charge it at all. Now, it's easy to equate my ripoff to that ripoff, but on the bright side, I was able to return my item and I got a full refund. That was not the case for the people in the temple. So we've gotten two things thus far. First, this is a place of worship where there is no reverence. The money changers, the animal sellers are ripping them off. Secondly, animal sacrifice is not even necessary anymore. And thirdly, and lastly, the last reason we haven't mentioned is the treatment of the Gentiles. Now, as I've said before, this list of three comes from the Scottish scholar William Barclay. So I'd like to read you a quote by him regarding this exact story, something more specific that I think is important for all of us to understand. He's talking about the temple and the temple courts. And this is what Barclay says. The temple consisted of a series of courts leading into the temple proper and to the holy place. There was first the court of the Gentiles, then the court of the women, then the court of the Israelites, then the court of the priests. All of this buying and selling was going on in the court of the Gentiles, which was the only place into which a Gentile might come. Beyond that point, access to him was barred. So then if there was a Gentile whose heart God had touched, he might come into the court of the Gentiles to meditate and pray and distantly touch God. The court of the Gentiles was the only place of prayer he knew. So imagine that. That is the only place a Gentile was allowed to go according to Jewish law. And this is what the Gentile runs into? This place where people are getting ripped off, the poor are being made poor, they're exchanging money at a ridiculous rate, they're selling animals at a premium that is unfair and unjust. And then all of this, and that is where he gets to pray. This Gentile comes in, as Barclay says, perhaps touched by the hand of God. And this is the type of representation that the people of God give God? That's ridiculous. That's unbelievable. Though that's not the type of people that God's people should be. So we've got these three things, these three reasons why Jesus would have been angry. This is a place of worship where there was no reverence. Animal sacrifice was not required anymore. And then finally, there is terrible treatment of the Gentiles. Now let me try to put this in a bit more of a contemporary example, perhaps something that will ring a little truer for those of us in the 21st century. So imagine yourself, put yourself in the shoes of somebody who has not been to church in years, perhaps decades. And let's say one weekend you've decided this is the weekend you're going to go to church. Maybe you've been invited by someone. Maybe you feel the prompting and the prodding of God. But it's the weekend you are going to go to church. And you're not exactly sure why you've accepted this, but you have. And so Thursday turns into Friday, and Friday turns into Saturday, and you get up on Saturday morning a little early, and you get on your computer, and you Google Seventh-day Adventist churches in my area, and you find one. You find one that looks nice, and you think, okay, that's where I'll go. So you get up, you get dressed, you put something nice on because you know that's how you should dress, and you're driving to this church. Well, on the way to church, you happen to be looking and you pass by, what you see there out of the corner of your eye, is this store with green highlights. And on the store it says Starbucks coffee. And you think, hey, it's a Saturday morning. I could go for some coffee. So you pull in, you spend a couple minutes there, you get the coffee, and you think, oh, great. You get back into your car, and you head to church. Well, you're a little nervous, obviously, and you finally park. You take a moment or two to mentally prepare yourself for some place you haven't been to for years, perhaps not even since your high school or college days. But then you think, hey, maybe I'll run into someone I know from long ago. And that gets your courage up a little bit. So you get out of the car, coffee in hand, and you walk toward the front door. Well, as you approach the front door, you notice this little sign there, and it says, no outside food or drink allowed. And you think, are you kidding? I've barely drank a fourth of this thing, and they're not letting people bring in food or drink. And you think, that's all right. I've come here to worship God, perhaps to reconnect with old friends. I'll be fine. So you take that cup of coffee, you see the garbage can right there, and you throw it away. Well, you walk in, and you see the welcome table. And you notice at the welcome table that there is coffee. Imagine that. You can't bring your own in, but they've got coffee here, and you think, at least I'll get the rest of this coffee. So you go up, you take the little cup they've got there, and you are about to begin to fill it up when you notice that it costs $17 for this tiny cup of coffee, and you think, are you kidding? We're not allowed to bring in our own stuff, yet they're going to charge us $17 for this tiny cup of coffee. That is ridiculous. I'm not going to pay that. You would never pay that. I would never pay that. No church we go to would pay that. And you look at the side of this nice little cardboard coffee dispenser, and you know what it says on the side? Starbucks coffee. And you think, no outside food or drink allowed? Are you kidding me? They just got this probably from the same Starbucks I went to. And the anger begins to build. It begins to rise. Now, you may look at me and you may think, come on, Austin, that's ridiculous. We would never do that in one of our churches. One, we're Adventists. We don't serve coffee. And secondly, even if we were to, we're not going to charge $17 for a tiny cup. We would give it to people for free. This is the holy Sabbath day. We don't sell things. And I would look at you and say, well, you're probably right, on all counts, in fact. But imagine with me for a second as if that were your reality, because that is the reality that the people are living in this time of Jesus. All those things that they're going through, all these reasons that Jesus is angry, is because of similar reasons to those that I've just described in a contemporary manner. So I guess the question then begs, what are we going to do about it when we are angry about injustices in this world? Well, let's finish reading this text. John chapter 2, once again, this time starting in verse 17. John writes, "His disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.' The Jews then responded to him, 'What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?' Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days.' They replied, 'It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?' But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what he was in each person." So you see, there's a bit of a reaction here to the way Jesus does things. In fact, there are two groups of people, and they react in different manners. So first, I'm actually going to look at the second group of people briefly here. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, teachers of the laws, the Jews. And it says there that they react kind of nonchalantly. They don't really seem to care. They respond by saying, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?" He says, "Destroy the temple, I'll build it in 3 days." And they think that's ridiculous. But they don't realize, as the text says, that he is referring to himself, to his own body, because that's what's going to happen. So that's group one. You could react indifferently. You could say, ridiculous. I don't care about any of that. Whatever. But then we have the second group. And the second group is his disciples. And we see it once again there in verse 17. It says this, "His disciples remembered that it is written, 'Zeal for your house will consume me.'" Now, the disciples are not a dumb group of people. They don't always get what Jesus is trying to teach them immediately, but they usually catch on eventually, either through their own brain or Jesus helps them catch up by telling them different things. So, the disciples react in a different way. They remember what Jesus said, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And then they act. Now, once again, if John's chronology is true, Jesus will not die for nearly 3 years after this story happens. So although they will not be moved to action until after that happens, they act. And it's important to note that when we are called to do things, if we don't act on them immediately, it's better to be late than never, as they say. It's better to do something eventually than to sit there apathetically forever. And so the disciples will ultimately be turned to action. You can read the book of Acts. You can read the Pauline epistles. You can read the other pastoral epistles. You can read Revelation. This small church grows and grows and grows at a rate before unseen and after unseen as well. They are galvanized into action because of Jesus. And even though they may not understand it immediately, they will get there, and they'll get there eventually. You know, I'm reminded of a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and I think it's important, and I want to read it to you now. He says, "You spoke of our activity in Birmingham as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that my fellow clergymen would see my nonviolent efforts as those of the extremist. But as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a bit of satisfaction from being considered an extremist. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Pray for them that despitefully use you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the gospel of Jesus Christ? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand. I can do no other, so help me God. Was not John Bunyan an extremist? I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. Was not Abraham Lincoln an extremist? This nation cannot survive half slave and half free. Was not Thomas Jefferson an extremist? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate? Or will we be extremists for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice, or will we be extremists for the causes of justice? So after all, maybe the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. So, I guess that begs the question then of you, and begs the question then of me. How are we going to react? We'll all get angry at injustices and things that we see that aren't fair. But will we sit there on the couch and just click to the next channel and think, oh, somebody else will deal with that? Or will we rise up like the followers of Christ should and fight the injustices of the world and stand on the side of the marginalized and the downtrodden and the outcasts? I guess the choice is up to you, and the choice is up to me. I can't make you do anything. And you can't make me do anything. But we are called to be people of justice. Thank you so much for joining us today on Creating Disciples. We hope you have a wonderful day, and we hope that you join us next time.